September 9, Saturday. This is my first time recording reading a book, and it's raining outside, and it could be a little bit raining for you, and sorry for that. So what am I gonna read today is the book called Mud No Lotus by Thick Nhat Hanh, who is the best known Vietnamese and British teacher in the world. And I've heard about him a couple of years ago, and I have ever wanted to read his books. And this is my first book of Thick Nhat Hanh, Mud No Lotus. And the first title I'm gonna read is Suffering and Happiness Are Not Separate. When we suffer, we tend to think that suffering is all there is at that moment, and happiness belongs to some other time or place. People often ask, why do I have to suffer? Thinking we should be able to have a life without any suffering is diluted as thinking we should be able to have a left side without a right side. The same is true of thinking we have a life in which no happiness whatsoever is to be found. If the left says, right, you have to go away, I don't want you, I only want the left, that's nonsense, because then the left would have to stop existing as well. If there's no right, then there's no left. Where there's no suffering, there can be no happiness either, and vice versa. If we can learn to see and skillfully engage with both the presence of happiness and the presence of suffering, we will go in the direction of enjoying life more. Every day we go a little farther in that direction, and eventually we realize that suffering and happiness are not two separate things. Cold air can be painful if you are not wearing enough warm clothes. But when you are feeling overheated or you are working outside with proper clothing, the bracing sensation of cold air can be a source of healing, joy, and aliveness. Suffering isn't some kind of external, objective source of expression and pain. There might be things that cause you to suffer, such as loud music or bright lights, which may bring other people joy. There are things that bring you joy that annoy other people. The rainy day that ruins your plans for a picnic is a balm for the farmer whose field is parched. Happiness is possible right now, today, but happiness cannot be without suffering. Some people think that in order to be happy, they must avoid all suffering, and so they can constantly vigilant, constantly worrying. They end up sacrificing all their spontaneity, freedom, and joy. This is correct if you can recognize and accept your pain without running away from it. If you can recognize and accept your pain without running away from it, you will discover that although pain is there, joy can also be there at the same time. Some say that suffering is only an illusion, or that to live wisely we have to transcend both suffering and joy. I say the opposite. The way to suffer well and be happy is to stay in touch with what is actually going on. In doing so, you will gain liberating insights into the true nature of suffering and joy. This is the end of the first paragraph, and the next title is Mud No Lotus. Both suffering and happiness are of an organic nature, which means they are both transitory. They are always changing. The flower, when it wilts, becomes the compost. The compost can help grow a flower again. Happiness is also organic and impermanent by nature. It can become suffering, and suffering can become happiness again. If you look deeply into a flower, you see that a flower is made only of non-flower elements. In the flower, there is a cloud. Of course, we know a cloud isn't a flower, but without a cloud, a flower can't do. If there's no cloud, there's no rain and no flower can grow. You don't have to be a dreamer to see a cloud floating into a flower. It's really there. Sunlight is also there. Sunlight isn't flower. But without sunlight, no flower is possible. If we continue to look deeply into the flower, we see many other things, like the earth and the minerals. Without them, a flower cannot be. So, it is a fact that a flower is made only of non-flower elements. A flower can be by herself alone. A flower can only intervene with everything else. You can't remove the sunlight, the soil, or the cloud from the flower. In each of our palm village practice centers around the world, we have a lotus pond. Everyone knows we need to have mud for lotuses to grow. The mud doesn't smell so good, but the lotus flower smells very good. If you don't have mud, the lotus won't manifest. You can't grow lotus flowers on marble. Without mud, there can be no lotus. It is possible, of course, to get stuck in the mud of life. It is easy enough to notice mud all over you at times. The hardest thing to practice is not allowing yourself to be overwhelmed by despair. When you are overwhelmed by despair, all you can see is suffering everywhere you look. You feel as if the worst thing is happening to you. But we must remember that suffering is a kind of mud that we need in order to generate joy and happiness. Without suffering, there is no happiness. So we shouldn't discriminate against the mud. We have to learn how to embrace and cradle our own suffering and the suffering of the world with a lot of tenderness. When I lived in Vietnam during the war, it was difficult to see our way through that dark and heavy mud. It seemed like the destruction would just go on and on forever. Every day people would ask me if I thought the war would end soon. It was very difficult to answer because there was no end in sight. But I knew if I said, I don't know, that would only water their seeds of despair. So when people ask me that question, I replied, everything is impermanent, even war. It will end someday. Knowing that we could continue to work for peace, and indeed, the war did end. Now the former mother enemies are busily trading and touring back and forth, and people throughout the world enjoy practicing our traditions, teachings on mindfulness and peace. If you know how to make good use of the mud, you can grow beautiful lotuses. If you know how to make good use of suffering, you can produce happiness. We do need some suffering to make happiness possible. And most of us have enough suffering inside and around us to be able to do that. You don't have to create more. The title of another paragraph is, Did the Buddha Suffer? When I was a young monk, I believed that the Buddha didn't suffer once. He had become enlightened. Naively, I asked myself, what's the use of becoming a Buddha if you continue to suffer? The Buddha did suffer because he had a body, feelings, and perceptions like all of us. Sometimes he probably had a headache. Sometimes he suffered from rheumatism. If he happened to eat something not well cooked, then he had intestinal problems. So he suffered physically and he suffered emotionally as well. When one of his beloved students died, he suffered. How can you not suffer when a dear friend has just died? The Buddha wasn't a stone, he was a human being. But because he had a lot of insight, wisdom, and compassion, he knew how to suffer, and so he suffered much less. The Four Noble Truths. The very first teaching the Buddha gave after his enlightenment was about suffering. It is called the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha's Four Noble Truths are: there is suffering, there is a cause of action that generates suffering. Suffering ceases. For example, like there is happiness, and there is a cause of action leading to the cessation of suffering, the arising of happiness. When you first hear that suffering is a noble truth, you might wonder, what's so noble about suffering? The Buddha was saying that if we can recognize suffering, and if we embrace it and look deeply into its roots, then we will be able to let go of the habits that feed it and at the same time find a way to happiness. Suffering has its beneficial aspects. It can be an excellent teacher. What suffering is made of? There is the suffering of the body, including the sensations of pain, illness, hunger, and physical injury. Some of this suffering is simply unavoidable. Then there is the suffering of the mind, including anxiety, jealousy, despair, fear, and anger. We have the seeds, the potential in us for understanding, love, compassion, and insight, as well as the seeds of anger, hate, and greed. Why we can avoid all of the suffering in life? We can suffer much less by not watering the seeds of suffering inside us. Are you at war with your body? Do you neglect or punish your body? Have you truly gotten to know your body? Can you feel at home with your body? Suffering can be either physical or mental or both, but every kind of suffering manifests somewhere in the body and creates tension and stress. We are told that we should release the tension in our body. Many of us have tried very hard. We want to release the tension in our body, but we can't release it. Our attempts at reducing tension in us won't work unless we first acknowledge that it is there. When you cut off your finger, you just wash it and your body knows how to heal. When a non-human animal living in the forest is injured, she knows what to do. She stops searching for something to eat or looking for a mate. She knows, through generations of ancestral knowledge, that it is not good for her to do so. She finds a quiet place and just lies down, doing nothing. Non-human animals intensively know that stopping is the best way to get healed. They don't need a doctor, a drugstore, or a pharmacist. We human beings used to have this kind of wisdom, but we have lost touch with it. We don't know how to rest anymore. We don't allow the body to rest, to release the tension and heal. We rely almost entirely on medication to deal with sickness and pain. Yet, the most effective ways to ease and transform our suffering are already available to us without any prescription and at no financial cost. I am not suggesting without any prescription and at no financial cost. I am not suggesting that you should throw away all your medications. Some of us do need to use certain medicines, but we can sometimes use them in smaller quantities and to much greater effect when we know how to let our body and mind truly rest. So I'm gonna stop reading here and let's continue tomorrow.